I was organizing a trip with my in-laws and decided to call my son Anthony to see if he had any plans. When I reached him, he said, "You all should go and have fun. Isn't this trip a bit unusual? Are you okay, Mom?" I assured him, "I'll manage. I'll bring you back a souvenir. Work hard at your practice." Anthony has always had a passion for running marathons, just like me. He even received a college scholarship for his talent, though he lives in the dorms to avoid commuting, only coming home during holidays. I knew he wouldn't be able to join us on this trip, but I wanted to check anyway. His response was what I expected. "I'm Flora, 46 years old, and I work full-time. My husband Steve is 4 years older than me and used to be my boss. I respect him for his capabilities. After we married and had our son, we were a happy family. However, over time, our relationship began to suffer, mainly due to Steve's parents, particularly his mother. From the start, she didn't like me and often bullied me. Initially, Steve defended me since we lived far from his parents and rarely saw them. But when our son, Anthony, wanted to attend a high school near my mother's house because of his passion for marathoning, things changed. I had introduced him to running, and I was thrilled that he enjoyed it as much as I do. I persuaded Steve to move closer to the high school, and he applied for a job transfer to facilitate the move. Anthony's success in high school helped him get into a good university, making the move worthwhile. The day before our trip, Steve said, "You need to get the rental car tomorrow morning and pick up my parents on your way back." I was confused and asked, "Why am I the one renting the car? What will you be doing?" Steve explained, "I'm exhausted from work, so I'll sleep in. Once you pick up my parents, come back, and I'll drive from there. It's on the way to where we're going anyway." Although I understood his reasoning, I was very tired myself. Despite working similar hours, I handled all the house chores. We used to share chores equally, but since moving closer to his parents, they started visiting often, which disrupted the balance. Steve's mother constantly disapproved of him doing any housework, insisting it was a wife's job. This led Steve to stop doing chores altogether, influenced heavily by his mother. Over time, Steve began to echo her views, and I found it increasingly challenging to address the issue. I am sometimes the breadwinner, but it felt futile to try to fix things, and I lacked the energy to even attempt it. Steve's work performance declined, and he frequently took out his frustrations on me. Arguing only led to more problems, so I decided to accept the situation as it was, believing it was the least stressful option. Though I considered divorce, I worried it might affect our son's chances of getting into college, so I set the idea aside. Instead, I started viewing my husband more like a pet than a person, which surprisingly reduced my stress. Eventually, I concluded that divorce wasn't worth the effort. I agreed to the trip because it was to a resort I loved. I knew I could enjoy myself even if it meant doing things alone. I was prepared to spend time separately from my in-laws and husband if necessary. My husband and father-in-law could both drive, so I figured it wouldn't be a problem. I played along with the notion that our dog was being demanding again, which Steve used as an excuse for me to handle the car rental. When I went to my in-laws' house to pick up the rental car, my mother-in-law criticized me for being late and said, "This car is too small. You should have rented a bigger one." I responded, "Well, it's better than your tiny car at least." I had bought the car myself for commuting to work, assuming it would primarily be mine. Steve used it without asking and showed his parents around in it. My mother-in-law's criticism about the car size, implying I could only afford a small one, annoyed me. I suggested using my father-in-law's car for the trip, but he didn't want anyone else driving it and refused to drive himself, so we rented a car. I wasn't consulted about this decision, and I ended up having to pick up the rental car and drive while they sat comfortably in the back seat. This made me want to tell them to arrange their own transportation. Despite Steve's promise to help with driving, he slept through the entire trip. My father-in-law refused to drive unless it was his car, leaving me to drive the whole way while Steve napped in the passenger seat. My father-in-law continuously criticized my driving, offering late suggestions and questioning my decisions at traffic lights. It was stressful, especially since he had been in many accidents and should have given up his license. My mother-in-law joined in with the criticism, which was frustrating because she couldn't drive herself. When we arrived at the resort, my husband finally woke up, tired from the day in the car. We followed my in-law's suggestion to relax at the hotel rather than engage in outside activities. I enjoyed unwinding by swimming in the pool and exploring the hotel grounds. After a delicious dinner and a relaxing spa visit, I returned to our room to find my husband already asleep. I wasn't sure what my in-laws were doing next door but assumed they were asleep as well. When I woke up the next morning, I found an unbelievable sight. My husband was gone, and his belongings were missing. I frantically searched the room and tried to contact my in-laws next door, but there was no answer. I was frantic. I tried calling my husband's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I knocked on the door of my in-laws' room, but there was no response. I ran down to the front desk, hoping they might have seen something or could help me track down my husband, but they hadn't seen anyone leaving or anything out of the ordinary. My mind raced with worry and confusion. I was at a loss for what to do next. I knew I needed to find my husband and figure out where he had gone. As I was pacing around the lobby, my thoughts kept returning to the possibility that he had left without a word, but why? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like something was seriously wrong. After a few hours of searching and waiting, my in-laws finally emerged from their room. I approached them, trying to stay calm despite my growing anxiety. I asked if they had seen anything or if they knew where Steve might have gone. My mother-in-law looked surprised and said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. My father-in-law seemed more detached, shrugging and saying he hadn't seen Steve since last night. With no other leads, I decided to check if there were any local police or security services that could assist in locating him. I was in a state of panic, and the resort staff, although sympathetic, were limited in their ability to help. I gave them a detailed description of Steve and his belongings, hoping that someone might have seen something. Hours passed, and my anxiety only grew. The idea that my husband had left without telling me or providing any explanation was both baffling and painful. It felt like he had vanished into thin air. I tried to think of any possible reason for his disappearance. Was there something I missed, something that could explain his actions? Eventually, I managed to get in touch with the local authorities. They promised to look into the situation and would let me know if they found any leads. In the meantime, I returned to our room, hoping that maybe Steve would come back on his own. As I waited, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led to this moment, the strain in my relationship with Steve, the ongoing issues with my in-laws, and the difficult dynamics we had been navigating. It felt like everything was coming to a head in the most unexpected and distressing way possible. The hours turned into a long, agonizing day, and as night fell, I still had no word from the authorities or any sign of Steve. My in-laws seemed to be as unsettled as I was, but their concern felt superficial compared to my own. I spent the night in a restless state, worrying about what might have happened and hoping for some resolution to this unsettling mystery. When I checked with the front desk, I found out that the others had already eaten breakfast an hour earlier than I had been informed. It felt like they had deliberately left me behind. To make matters worse, I had to cover the cost of the hotel checkout myself. Although my mother-in-law had offered to pay for our stay, it seemed that this was just a ploy. With no other option, I paid for both rooms and left the hotel, only to discover that there was no car waiting for me. While I was trying to figure out what to do next, my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law, asking where I was. Confused, I inquired why they hadn't left together from the start. She casually replied that she thought I had shown interest in joining them because I mentioned wanting to visit the resort while watching TV with my husband. Normally, remembering such details would be endearing, but in this situation, it felt like a tactic to aggravate me. I had done most of the driving to get there, so why was I being reminded that I was essentially brought here by my mother-in-law, who neither drove nor contributed financially? Frustrated, I sighed and suggested that we go sightseeing as a family and head home afterward. My mother-in-law retorted that I could also do some sightseeing and then return, jokingly suggesting that I could run back since I was good at marathons. Her laughter only made me more exasperated. Demanding to speak to my husband, I asked my mother-in-law to put him on speakerphone. When Steve came on the line, he greeted me cheerfully and reminded me of the laundry that needed to be done by the next morning. Any warmth I had previously felt towards him vanished. I snapped back, telling him to do his own laundry. He countered by saying, as the breadwinner, I should be thankful and take it easy. His comment about being the breadwinner only fueled my anger. I told him that this would be the last time we would see each other since we mostly only saw each other when I was asleep. Puzzled, he asked what I meant, and I firmly stated that we needed to head back home today due to the laundry and house cleaning. I clarified that I was not going back and revealed that I would be filing for divorce. I reminded him of our conversation from 6 months ago when he had confessed his intention to marry his childhood friend and leave me. 6 months ago, I had sensed something was wrong and confronted my husband, who admitted he wanted to divorce me to marry his childhood friend, a single mother. Although he had given me pre-filled divorce papers, I couldn't bring myself to finalize the divorce. We had a period of silence until he needed my help with household chores and asked me to forget his earlier statements. I couldn't, so I started gathering evidence of his infidelity. I questioned whether this trip was an attempt to win me back, especially since this conversation happened 3 months after I quit my job, which I had shared with Steve. He had reassured me at the time that I would find a new job quickly, but now I had only secured a part-time position, which led me to question my situation further.